Lead balloons.
Lead balloons.
The alchemy of unpopular opinions.
Unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off.
And I know that you're out to get the ladies.
We're not encouraged to think critically.
Life is hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Oh my god. That's hilarious. Busted.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. And yes, folks, I am sitting in the flesh here in Lakewood, Colorado with my buddy Trent. How you doing, buddy?
Feeling good. I think, doing good, looking good, all the above.
All the goods.
Yeah.
All the goods.
Yeah.
I wanted to offer a little bit of a disclaimer before we get going. We've gotten a little bit of feedback. Most of it is really, really good. And the only people we're offending are the right kinds of people, in my opinion. I was telling Trent, we're offending the kind of people Jesus would offend. So, which is usually really staunch religious people or, politically dogmatic people. And so, they're probably not going to like our conversation. So that's great. But we've gotten a little bit of feedback from people around, I wish there was a female voice or LGBTQ voice or person of color voice, representing. And kind of what we're hearing in this is that we wish you would represent my perspective more. And we just want to say, that's great. I'm so happy you're engaging, but we cannot functionally represent everybody. We're not a news organization. It is not even our goal to represent everyone. I don't know. Trent, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel the same way that, like we talked about before, podcasting is a pretty democratic thing. There's so much space for everybody. It's not like running for office. Pretty much anybody can do this, if you have a basic amount of equipment. So if you want to get in the game, you can get in the game. Mm-hmm. And there's so many voices, a plurality of voices in this space that there's no reason for us to try to be exhaustive and cover every base. And it just almost goes without saying, although we're saying it now, that we won't represent every perspective. Joel and I are here talking about the stuff that we want to talk about, and we hope you'll find it interesting. And we want to hear your thoughts too and your feedback to give us some ideas and know how it's landing. But we are presenting a limited perspective by definition, so we hope you'll give us some grace with that.
Yeah, it is limited, and I view this as an exercise of self-expression. Like Trent and I are self-expressing, and we do want to make this product as good as possible. So if you creating your own kind of avenue, a YouTube channel or whatever isn't really something you're interested in, another option would be just shoot us an email. Mm-hmm. Give us some feedback on your experience. We will read it. We'll do our best to integrate that into our understanding so that we can have, we want to be fair. We want our thoughts and our conversations to land well. So anyways,
could also just drop in quickly that you can find us at leadballoonspod.com. Our YouTube channel is Lead Balloons Podcast. You can find us on Spotify, Podbean, Lead Balloons Podcast, and at leadballoonspod.com, our website. We also have a blog where both Joel and I are blogging, and you can hear episodes on the website.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we're waiting to get on Apple. They take forever for whatever reason. Okay, so today's going to be a pretty significant lead balloon, calling it Maintain Monogamy or Practice Promiscuity. So,
whoops, I have somewhere to be.
Should humans maintain monogamy or practice promiscuity? What are we wired for? If wiring is even the right way to think about it, how much of our sexual behavior depends on cultural context? Today's podcast will explore these questions. So, Trent, I've been married, divorced. Now I'm getting married again. And I'm just curious because you've never been married. What is the skin in the game that you have for this conversation?
Just to try to be an asshole.
Fair. That's fair.
No, I'm very fascinated in anthropology, and I'm interested in psychology. I guess there'll be some overlap with that, but I obviously, my own romantic life makes me interested in these kinds of questions, but also I've seen now, when I was 20, I didn't have a big sample size, and now I've seen the relationships of many of my close close friends and family, and I've seen how some of those have played out, and it's given me the opportunity to really ask a lot of questions and figure out, what do I think about some of these things? And you hear about people's experiences in relationships and wonder if monogamy is the answer, or if not, ethical non-monogamy is a better option. It's a process. I'm learning a lot, and I have a lot of interesting thoughts, and I think it's becoming a pretty reasonably mainstream cultural discussion, although there's a long way to go, but it's in the zeitgeist, and it's worth us knowing about for that reason.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I hope you don't mind me highlighting this. We talked about it earlier. You also come from a divorced home.
Come from a divorced home, and that rattled me. If you haven't come from that space, I mean, people in intact homes can suffer a lot as well, but there are unique challenges that you faced as a child in a broken home, and it makes you ask a lot of hard questions, and it forces you to face confusing realities, and that led me down the path of asking a lot of these questions, try to get answers for it.
That makes sense to me. And I hope you don't mind, for those on YouTube, I'm going to be looking down to read a couple of these stats. Why this topic? Well, some of the relevant data points is there was on YouGov, there were polled that 55% of Americans today prefer complete monogamy. And a 2023 poll found that about a third of Americans would describe their ideal relationship as something other than traditional monogamy. And Vox actually did a series, VOX, in 2018 called Explained, where they dedicated a whole episode kind of talking about this. They brought in sexologists, they brought in experts on anthropology, and they just began to just kind of look at, like, where's monogamy in the history of human beings, and is that our most natural leaning? And I mean, you can just scroll through YouTube, just type in polyamory, and you will find lots and lots of opinions about it. Some very for it, some curious, some very vehemently against it. So to Trent's point, people are talking about it, and it is 100% a lead balloon conversation. So this is happening. All right, so let's talk definitions. Trent, could you explain what is meant by monogamy? What kinds of behaviors would fall under the rubric of non-monogamy?
Yeah, so monogamy would be just an exclusive sexual relationship. Maybe that could also be defined as an exclusive, like, emotional relationship between two people.
Yeah,
male, female, female, female.
Like a specific, like, intimacy level.
Yeah, that's
emotionally.
Right. Yeah. That's right. It's only available to that couple. And then non-monogamy would include things like you mentioned, polyamory, open relationships, swinging, cuckolding, don't ask, don't tell, having affairs would fall into the rubric of being non-monogamous, these kinds of things. So that's basically what would fall into that.
So do you know of any, like, stories of people you've heard or people you actually know that who have practiced non-monogamy, and kind of what's your read on all that?
I'm becoming aware of people who have practiced a form of non-monogamy through personal acquaintances and friends of friends that I've heard about. And then I have also read about them, about the existence in our culture. I've watched YouTube videos about these things. And then obviously because of my interest in reading about anthropology, I'm aware of different sexual practices in different areas of the world, and people who are living in a more quote unquote primitive fashion in some of their sexual practices. So I'm becoming more aware of non-traditional sexual practices.
Which is interesting. If it's more indigenous and ancient, what is traditional mean?
Exactly. Right.
So that's it's very interesting to me. And I'll throw in there that I don't have a ton of anecdotal evidence or experience. I will say, though, the few experiences that I have had with people telling me about they're exploring these kind of topics, whether they're exploring polyamory with their committed partner, or whether they're just trying to, like, come up with different, like, structures of consent. There's been a lot of confusion I've seen, and it's not a bowl of cherries for them. But I do think this conversation is really, really interesting, because I don't see a bowl of cherries with the monogamous world either.
Dan Savage, who is a relationship advice columnist and a pretty well-known public figure, an important public figure in my opinion, has said that like 50% of 50%, I think, of people at some point in their life will be involved in sort of a extramarital affair, which he's basically saying that almost every like long relationship will be touched at some point potentially by unfaithfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And so just that alone necessitates an informed discussion about these things, if for no other reason that when it happens, that a couple will be prepared for what that is going to do to them and what might it mean moving forward.
Yeah.
And so these are important discussions to have. And yes, no, I'm not today. You won't hear us basically being polemicists on one side or the other, because we recognize the complexity of this issue. And, it's not really a utopian.
And I don't even know that we see things exactly the same way.
No, we don't. You're going to hear us probably having different viewpoints on this one.
Yeah. All right. So Trent, you've done a lot of, read a lot about anthropology, theories regarding mating and tribal practices. Can you share with us some of the more interesting things that you found?
Yes. So, the big thing that I'm learning as I'm reading about the sexual practices of tribes that are extant, that are available today,
Sure.
As well as ones that we know about in the past or can surmise in the past, that people around the world have had many different forms of sexual practice, many different forms of marriage, understandings of marriage, even within our own culture. The way that marriage was practiced 2,000, 3,000, I'm sorry, not that's going too far. In like the Western world, the past few hundred years, things have changed. The way it was more transactional, less about a romance and finding your soulmate. I mean, this has changed a lot, but there's quite a wide variety of sexual practices that are existent. And so that's one of the biggest things that I found. There's sort of not like, people want to have a very simple narrative of how humans behave sexually. So if I can know the way that women select sexually or men select sexually, then I can give all this kind of advice on my YouTube channel,
because it's universal.
Because women want this, because we know that this is true in evolution, and so this is what you ought to do. And the problem is, it's much more complicated than that, given what we do know and a lot of that we don't know.
I mean, and a lot of these views come from religion too, or social structures. And it's so interesting when you look through history. Here's this promoted right way, and it's almost never ever followed by most people in power. And then a lot of societies are touched a lot by the kind of, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? The like not following the value. And so it feels like a betrayal. It feels like something really like catastrophic has happened. And so would it feel as catastrophic if we were so dogmatic about these views as being the only right way? I think that's a fair question.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, please continue. What else have you learned?
Yeah, one of the things, I spend a decent amount of time, for good or ill, listening to YouTube channels that are devoted to, let's say, giving men advice on how to find women. And this,
of course you do.
Yeah. Shocker. And one of the big refrains in many of these channels is sort of this basic understanding of evolutionary psychology, whereby here's the tale. Here's the standard narrative that you're treated to in many corners. In prehistoric times, you had a man going out, and he would bring back, he'd go hunting, and he would bring back meat. It's usually a saber-toothed tiger for whatever reason.
Sure.
We really had a thing for saber-toothed tigers.
They're delicious.
He brings back a saber-toothed tiger, so he provides meat and protection, protection for the woman. That's his contribution. In exchange for that, he gets sex from the woman and the promise of her sexual fidelity. And that's important because it's assumed that paternity certainty, the ability of that man to know that this is his child, is really, really important, and because he doesn't want to invest in raising a child that doesn't have his genes.
Cavemen were all about those
that's
practicalities.
Right. And so my problem with that is twofold. One is that we know that there were a variety of configurations and hunting practices in today's world amongst tribal peoples and in ancient times. And so there are just good reasons to question that narrative. For example, we know that there were, if you just stop and think about it, like use basic logic and think about what is the likelihood that in a dangerous environment where you weren't the apex predator, that you would go out alone, miles from your house, kill a saber-toothed tiger with your spear, bow, and arrow, drag that 300-pound beast or 400-pound whatever beast back to your campsite without being attacked on the way and having it stolen, and then give it to your wife, and then protecting her from the 10 other men who are your size and equally armed.
Yeah.
Like,
Who have the hots for your wife.
By the way, when has this happened? But we do know that there were time periods where human beings, many thousands of years ago, hunted large game like woolly mammoths.
Yeah.
And those were large game that would have required team hunting. And what would have likely happened almost certainly is they would have worked as a team to kill this animal. Then they would have had they would probably been able to cure some of the meat, but they would have also had these huge feasts. And likely the women would have not even realized like who delivered the final blow to that mammoth. A completely irrelevant question that we did it as a group and we share it as a group. So the need for a woman to have one man to rely upon for provision, irrelevant. The need for in a highly cooperative, collaborative environment where people were needed to work together to survive, would protection. Who would she need to be protected for by one man? So then you look at it from that standpoint, and that narrative just crumbles.
Yeah,
it's
I
so
had no idea that this was
and
a
simplistic.
Thing. Yeah, I didn't know this was a thing. That
the saber-toothed tiger narrative.
Yeah, I mean, as a way to like give men advice on how to like be masculine and attract women. Let's look back at our ancient and our ancestors, and this is how they did it. And it's just such a shallow story that, like, to me, it's like, sure, like you wanna communicate these things that to men that you can do these sorts of things, and these will be perceived as attractive. Why do you need to fabricate an anthropological story to justify it? Yeah.
There's another story, if I can share this one, that just shows how complicated it can be. Number one, we don't know exactly how human beings were living 100,000 years ago. There are so many questions.
Nobody knows.
But we do know about how some of them are living in recent memory and in recent times. There's a group, I believe, in the Amazon where people in that tribe believe that the fetus is the result of accumulated semen from multiple partners.
Oh, wow.
So a woman who wants to have a smart, handsome, funny, musically gifted, great storytelling child or whatever.
Well-rounded.
Yes. Will have sex with the men who represent those
this
qualities.
Is like the Montessori approach to having sex.
But I mean, in that environment, and how many other groups had practices like that? So this idea of like, find the alpha male with the broad shoulders and the perfect chin and the best hunter and the strongest and all these things. It's like,
that's not
do
always
we know
happening.
that happened exactly like that? Certainly some of that story is likely true, but there are other instances in which that doesn't explain everything.
Well, you introduced me to the Muoso people, right? Isn't that their name? Tell me about them.
The Moswo.
Yeah. Moswo. Yeah. So tell us about them.
So, okay, this is very interesting because once you sort of branch out and learn more about what's happening in the world and expand your knowledge of social science and anthropology, you learn that the way that we think, that the uniformity of behavior that we imagine for human beings is just not the case. Yeah. Whether that's due to specific choices that we make or ecological necessity, whatever, it's just much less simple. So there's a group in southwestern China called the Moswo, and I think this particular group is like 40,000 people, and they've been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This tribe is matriarchal.
Yep.
So the households are arranged and matrilineal. So arranged around the female head of household. They're squarish households with a big courtyard, and these are agricultural people. And basically what happens in that environment for their sexual behavior is that when the young woman comes of age and is ready to make herself available for sex with men, she will have her own room. And she, at nightfall, a man can request entrance to her room. And if she wants him to be there, he will come and they will fuck around. Now, he might come for days, months, months, years, and have what's called a walking marriage, or maybe she has multiple partners, over a span of years or whatever. The big thing is generally their sexual practices are kept secret. It happens. He comes at night. He leaves in the morning. In the morning, he goes back to his household. And when he goes back to his household, he is expected to be responsible for raising his sister's children. So the role of uncles as fathers is much more important than biological fathers as fathers in that environment. Yeah. And so you have people are supposed to keep their sexual life private. Men are generally at night going and staying with their lover at the time, and knowing having a connection with your biological father is not that important. Now, what I find to be fascinating about this story, not that it's right or wrong or whatever, it's acceptable. It's a different way of doing things. And what it shows is they've come up, for whatever reason, I don't know all the history of it, how they came to this practice, and I'm not sure if anybody does know the origin. But what we see from it is that it's a group of people who've come up with a way of accommodating our sexual proclivities, our desire for novelty and sexual enjoyment, in a way that still allows people to have stability when it comes to raising children. So women don't have to worry if they're going to be left alone. The ethos in that environment is, I can enjoy myself sexually, not have to tell people about it, and my kids will be taken care of by me and my immediate family. And I just thought that's amazing. That's one other way of saying
it works.
And it's been working for centuries.
Yeah.
Now, it's not perfect, and there are tensions right now. Even I've seen a documentary about how there are cultural pressures to change things, and there are people who marry outside the tribe, and that's not surprising. But it is an innovative way to make sense of our human sexuality.
I read some articles about it too, and it's just that it's really come on the radar of a lot of like feminist groups. Like, this is the feminist kingdom, this matriarchal world, and I thought that was really interesting. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about historical context, and in studying church history, I learned over and over again that theology is never born in a vacuum, and I'm sure you kind of came to that conclusion too as you begin to study the beliefs and the doctrine and the dogma that happens. It's very tied to the context, the language that people speak, the cultural preferences and practices that people have, the geography, which impacts political relationships and war and different economic perspectives that people have. And all these things are tied together, and then they create norms, like beliefs and norms. And these societal norms are not like, they don't fall from the heaven. Oh, like this is what thou shalt do, right? Even the 10 Commandments are pretty like loose with their prescription. There's a lot of different ways to have a society where you don't kill people. You know what I mean? There's a lot of wiggle room there. So it's so my perspective on that is that they're always evolving, and people who are blind to this or choose to be blind to this, they're the kind of people who say stupid things like, if it's good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? Good enough to Paul? Right. Yeah, it's like I see marital norms through that lens of evolution as well. It's why again, I'm not as passionate and interested in these topics, I think, as you are. But I find this to be a very important conversation because it's clear that some evolution is happening, at least in America and the Western world, around these practices. And as you're talking about things that have existed outside of the Western world for centuries, it's like, oh, this has never been new. Yeah. This is actually a conversation that the menu of options is a lot longer than I was told when I was a kid. And again, I'm not promoting, prescribing anything. I'm just like, the conversation should not be completely narrowed down simply for fear of having the conversation.
And that to me is the value of anthropology, in that one of the many things it can do for us is open our eyes to the many, many different ways that human beings organize their lives politically, sexually, economically. There's so much more variety than people are aware of. And when you become aware of these things, it expands your horizons, your repertoire. And so I'm a big ideas guy, like grand ideas.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not practical, but I want to talk about them because I think I want to think that imagination is extremely important. One of my favorite quotes from William Blake is, what was once imagined is now proved. And if you think about discoveries, mathematical, scientific, whatever, that's true. You had to imagine it first, and then it came into being. So not every idea needs to be practiced. But whenever I start hearing people get so dogmatic about knowing that this is the only one, capitalism is the only way that human beings can live, sexual monogamy is the only available option, I'm like, it isn't. And I'm the kind of, and I want to say to these people, I don't know if you'd be interested in reading more than one book, but there are other books out there, and you'll read about them and you realize there are other options. And you don't necessarily have to do anything with that knowledge, but you should start with knowing it. And then we can change the conversation. And even if the only result of the conversation was not feeling bad about our sexual proclivities, that maybe we do have potentially a evolutionary history of non-monogamy, we wouldn't feel bad about looking at a gal or a girl looking at we wouldn't get jealous if we see our woman looking at another man. We'd be like, yeah, that has been part of our past. It's been practiced.
It makes sense that I feel this way. I'm not going to judge it.
I can sit with these feelings.
Yeah, and as you kind of talk about that, everyone, one of my views is that when education does its proper work on us, we become more humble, not arrogant. The people who aren't, good education is exposure to new ideas, and then we have to be open to them, and we begin to see the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, and that's where humility begins to come into play. And I find that to be the real antidote to this kind of egoic dogma that so many people don't know how to break free of. And that's what we hope to evoke. Again, we're not representing every perspective, but we hope to evoke for people the challenge of becoming more humble about whatever you believe, not to change what you believe, but at least to be less judgmental and more open. So Trent, with that being said, can you make a case? I'd like to get into the whys behind some of these things. Can you make a case? I'm going to ask you to be both sides of the debate.
That's right.
Right. When we're in high school and you have to argue one side or the other. And so why monogamy might be the best option for humanity today?
Well, you talk about historical context and things that happen in a vacuum. So we talked about the most old people. They have an infrastructure to support non-monogamy. One of the great threats to non-monogamy is the insecurity that people might have, a woman might have, for who's going to take care of my child. That's an enormous commitment of time and energy. And to not have a guarantee that a man is going to be involved in protecting and being raising that child is huge.
So the infrastructure doesn't support it as well. So the infrastructure
doesn't support it. Our cultural norms don't support it. Think about environments where people were more in hunter-gatherer environments where people were nomadic and didn't have a lot of property and had a loose conception of property and would share almost everything. They'd be more likely to share sexuality. People in our culture, we say, this is my house, my wife, my property, girlfriend, my husband. They belong to me. And I can't share them in a way with you that would threaten my access to them. So our conceptual range does not allow for it. We don't have a sense. I mean, we're taught to share in kindergarten, and that ends once you hit the workforce. We don't have that sense of sharing. We just don't have a real good infrastructure for it. So I think that unless we can move in that direction, I probably am an advocate for monogamy, and maybe even more radical monogamy. Like, for instance, such an interesting place that we're at as a culture, because we had the sexual revolution 60s and 70s, where basically largely people think you can kind of fuck around before marriage. It's kind of we've accepted that. And, sexual expression and wearing almost nothing is viewed as okay, but people can be titillated sexually by other people, but then know that that's totally off limits. You can watch, Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders or some chick in a Carl's Jr.'s commercial, just like in a burger or whatever.
Yeah, and their cleavage is like
just right there for you.
Yeah.
It's like going to a restaurant and the steak comes by, the steak, this wonderful filet mignon, you're like that, and you're like, oh, where's that? I want to get that. Like, oh, we just bring that around for decoration and for titillation.
Exactly.
It's not available.
Yeah, the hunger you'll need to wait is actually illegal.
You'll need to wait 12 years or whatever to do that, and so there's this titillation, but there's a non satisfaction of these things. So we have this weird sort of, on the one hand, we want to arouse your sexuality, and then we want to quell it at the same time.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I do think that is part of what is the motivation with a lot of purity culture, is a way to protect the kind of self-imposed ideal of monogamy. So to protect that, we make women like wear loose-fitting clothes, cover their faces, not even to like be attracted to how pretty they are, and we see that as repressive. But the expressive part completely like undermines the ideal for monogamy, and so that's very interesting. Yeah, that there is an inconsistency there.
It's like you have to have a certain sexual personality before you get married or something, and then once you get married, that personality needs to change entirely, because you were free to do as much sort of messing around as you wanted to and think of sex in a certain way, and then when you get married, you have to completely change it. And it's like, what if we just kept it consistent?
But I'll add my 2 cents.
Okay.
I do think there's something to be said for the monogamy that happens in terms of the relationship capacity. There is, and I've seen this in people who do stay together for long periods of time. And as I hear their story, it's rarely ever like a full pretty story. Like, it's usually a very bumpy ride. Sometimes there is stories of infidelity in these long marriages. Sometimes it may not be sexual infidelity, but it's just like a solid decade of just dislike for each other,
missionary only.
And sometimes, I don't know, I can't, as a pastor, I've been invited into a lot of intimate details where people are just, they're not having sex, and that's really about like not their ability to have sex. It's usually psychological and emotional, what's happening in people's feelings and their inability to kind of like sit with things and be open. But those long relationships have a depth that I don't think can be achieved any other way. And it's kind of beautiful. Like, I find some of those relationships inspiring, in what they can accomplish in terms of the capacity for relational depth with another individual. And, that isn't to say just because it's a long relationship, they achieve that. I've met a lot of people who are together clearly because of just pure moral obligation, and they've gotten used to just being assholes to each other, and that's their new normal. So I'm not trying to, I think it's silly when people promote that. It's like, this is the ideal because it always leads to this good outcome. I think we have to be honest that clearly that's not happening, nor has it ever been happening. I think we have to be honest about that. But I think it's true. You can't achieve that any other way through a life of polyamory or promiscuity. I don't think those are pathways to get to that outcome. So it means that by choosing that path, you are not able to achieve this thing. And if that's something you really care about, that may be something to consider. I
think it's worth chiming in with that. Dan Savage has this concept of monogamish, and he is liberal politically, and but he is his background is he grew up Catholic. He says I'm conservative. He says I claim to be conservative because I want relationships to survive. And he has that phrase where he says, if you're married for 50 years and there's 1 or 2 infidelities, you guys aren't bad at fidelity. You're good at it. You're good at it. You had one mess up, a blowjob on a business trip or whatever, one mess up. And so he wants marriages, he is for stability and family life for the sake of the kids and your own well-being. And so if having at least good discussions with your partner, or at some point, if both partners feel comfortable, is opening it up to some kind of exploration, that if that stuff can get on the table more, it could lead to positive developments.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of sex therapists are trying to help couples explore different ways of connecting sexually so that they can at least almost fabricate the experience of promiscuity through role playing or through, you know, all kinds of things. They're actually trying to fabricate promiscuity within a monogamous relationship. And I think that's an interesting concept. Yep. Okay, let's go to this. Can you make a case why non-monogamy is the best option for humans today?
Well, one of the questions being asked, I think I've seen a character like Jordan Peterson that kind of asking, like, what can we do so that the most number of people can be sexually fulfilled? I believe a society where there's a great level of sexual fulfillment is a healthier society. Where there's consent and where there's it's an otherwise healthy environment. What kind of situation might provide for the most sex for the most number of people? That might be a non-monogamous context. Could very well be. So that would be one. Secondly, I do think that from the study that I've done, although you know that I'm against this notion of essentialism, claiming that humans are one thing, we are non-monogamous, we are monogamous. I do think that probably much of our human evolutionary past included sexual promiscuity, and that in itself is another podcast where we could talk about human anatomy and talk about chimps and bonobos and could talk about how our biology could support views like that. I do think that we're mostly wired for that. I think monogamy is extremely hard to do for a lot of people. For some people, it is not. So I think we're mostly wired for it. I think that new household structures would be needed. New kinds of configurations.
The infrastructure would have to change in order to support it.
Yes. So as a small, for instance, again, I've heard stories where this lasted for a little while and then blew up, but something like a blended household, where I've heard stories where it's either two men and one woman and they're raising children together, or it's two women and one man, or it's two couples that come together that have a polyamorous quadrant, and they raise children in that household together. Those are just it's one example of many, but having an environment where children were going to be guaranteed to be taken care of would be necessary to make this more practicable. And then the other thing I would say is, whenever I talk about like non-monogamy, a lot of times people will say, well, I've seen it just blow up. I've seen it explode. Sure. We're not good at it. It doesn't work. I'm like, well, we're not that great at monogamy either. I mean, half of all marriages end in divorce, and many people, there's the rate of affairs we know is very high. So we keep doing monogamy and believing it's the model, even though we suck at it. And so that the argument that we should do the thing that we don't suck at would apply to nothing, because we pretty much suck at everything we do when it comes to that. So that can't be a strong argument.
That's a fair point. And because my issues with a lot of the polyamory discussions is I mostly see it played out in ways that end in a lot of pain and heartache for people. And I genuinely kind of see people using these models as a way to just do what they want to do.
Yeah.
And there's usually people that are like hesitantly cooperating with a very strong-willed person who says, it's basically gaslighting them. It's like, this is okay, this is great, this is healthy, Yeah. So I've heard it say that some people know how to transcend jealousy. And that to me is interesting. I'm like, what if you could transcend jealousy? And I think that is a problem because most people can't. And that's another practicality around these issues that people have to really think about. And you brought up chimps and bonobos. I was doing a little research. There are animals in the animal kingdom that mate for life with one person or one other animal. Like a lot of birds are like that. Penguins, there's certain penguins, bald eagles. They have one mate for life. seahorses, weirdly, mate with, it's like, you're my boo-boo, right? But then you bring up, gibbons are a type of primate that we've observed mate with one, have one mate for life. But like chimps and bonobos and most of the other animal kingdom, it's not a thing. So that to me is like, when you look at nature, there is diversity.
Mhm.
And that to me makes me kind of back up and kind of
Mhm.
have this conversation with myself. Like, why do I have these strong feelings? And I can make an argument for both sides, but I think it boils down to is like, what am I really like interested in and willing to do? And
Mhm.
can I have open conversations with my my partner or partners in some cases that make this like tenable, as in terms of consent, in terms of satisfaction, in terms of the practicalities of partnerships
Yeah.
and these kinds of things. And so I think these conversations are important. But you have like deep in the Judeo-Christian history, like thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife kinds of conversations. And I think there must have been a practicality back then for that. And maybe it's the functionality of it as civilizations began to evolve and become more structured. The tribal kind of environments were more difficult to sustain in terms of relationships. What are your thoughts on that?
Can you restate that just
Yeah, I'm just curious,
at a
like, why
preflaps?
we see different kinds of, as you point out, the Moswa, or how do you say it?
Mosuo people.
Moswa people and these other perspectives that exist in these kind of infrastructures. You have thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. What if that is not an actual, like, just weird religious rule? What if it's like, this is actually helping us as a society
Right.
Functionally, like, move forward? It creates its own set of problems,
Right.
because we're maybe not great at it, but it actually is better than the alternative. I'm just curious what you think about that.
It all relates to the historical context they're in, the challenges that they face, and what they want to be about as a culture, and how important is paternity certainty. And every group of people has their own taboos, their own do's and don'ts that are related to what they value and what they're trying to accomplish. I've talked about the Piraha in another episode, the Piraha people in the Amazon, and they practice marriage, and they have marriages. Now, divorces happen in those cultures. It's usually happens very quickly, and without paperwork. But they and divorce lawyers and all that kind of stuff. But they still practice non-monogamy. They men and women both have experiences with multiple sexual partners. This is not, again, Daniel Everett, the guy who was a missionary there and a linguist, and he documented how he would see instances where people would, like, one guy had to stay home. He wanted this guy to come help him translate something. The guy had to stay home that day because the previous night he'd been out with another woman. He didn't get kicked out of the house. She had to just keep his head in her lap, and she kept whacking him, and just kind of punished him for a few hours. So she wasn't happy about it, but it didn't disintegrate the tribe, and nobody was killed and these kinds of things. So like, it was an environment where jealousy still was a thing, but it wasn't the end of the world. It was just sort of baked in. Like, yes,
this happens.
This will happen.
Yep.
And it happens.
Yep.
We're not going to avenge this particular thing. So jealousy, I think, is probably a human universal, but different cultures have different thoughts about it, and probably the ones that have less punitive codes, like thou shalt not covet, and this will be the result if you do, are probably less inclined to react in such a vehement, violent way towards it.
I think it's important for us to like acknowledge the stories that we're telling ourselves and where those stories came from. That's always been my interest in terms of studying culture and religion and spirituality. All those things are kind of tied together. And, as kind of what you're talking about, it makes me think about how easy it is to get married in our culture, and how ridiculously difficult it is to get divorced. It's so easy to get married, very easy. To get divorced is like grueling and expensive, and you have to jump through so many hoops. And so there's clearly a weird economy of right and wrong, of righteousness in our society that's built around that. And I don't know if that serves us anymore. what I'm seeing is most people now are really questioning the decision to be married, because they see the writing on the wall. We have this generation that so many of our parents are divorced. Mine are not, but I know many people who are. And it makes them question the stories we've been telling ourselves around the value of monogamous marriage. And then I think about the vows.
Yeah.
I've performed so many weddings in my time, and I think about the vows and the extraordinary weight, the language that we use, that is almost like silly.
Mm-hmm.
Like no one can follow these vows, some of these vows. It's just like, and the people who claim that they are, it's just like, yeah, but if we put your thoughts on a screen and everyone saw that throughout your life, we'd know that not a single person, male or female, is truly faithful in this way. I will love and cherish you until the day you die. No, you weren't loving or cherishing for a solid decade. It's just like some of these vows are just, they're not true. They're stories that we make up to try to romanticize our own lives.
Adam Phillips, a psychoanalyst I love, he talks about creating useful fictions for our lives that are not intended to humiliate us. That we ought to have a cultural discussion about pictures of good lives that we can aspire to that are realistically possible, but hold out the hope that we might become something that we don't know, that holds out. So like, why are we creating vows? What if a vow was something like, I'm going to try to like be a reasonably decent person towards you and not expecting that you'll meet all of my needs, but that we'll talk about it. Instead of like, I will to love, cherish in sickness and health till death do us part and all these kinds of things. Like, what about yearly renewable contracts?
Yeah.
We'll renew after a year. We'll revisit after a year. But we set up these impossible situations. We do it all in the context of a highly expensive wedding where we dress up like landed gentry from 300 years ago. God. For whatever reason, I need to wear a top hat for this that's not been in fashion for 200 years to remind everybody that I'm willing to play a ridiculous part for however long society requires me to play it. I'm quoting more or less Laura Kipnis from her book Against Love right there, but I have some strong feelings about it.
And I hear that, and I do want to make sure that everyone understands that both Trent and I offer different critiques, but like I believe weddings are beautiful, and I'm getting married next month. That we're recording this. I don't know when this will be released, but I will probably already be married when this gets released, and I've had a really beautiful time sitting down with my partner in fashioning our ceremony and who's going to be there to support it. And I believe in it, but I also believe in it with now a big fat asterisk at the top.
Yeah.
Because I know things now that I didn't know when I got married my first time.
Sure.
And that is life is life. And the stories that we tell ourselves often do not create a hopeful future for me, but one of fear and often shame, because I end up, no one can live up to the ideals we put on ourselves. So with that, like, what do you feel like are some of the goals of our conversation?
Right. Well, again,
this particular one.
Yeah. I mean, I want to open up further and better conversation about a topic that impacts our whole society. Let's talk about it. We have an opportunity to make some potential changes, and we ought not stultify the conversation. But part of the conversation involves expanding our knowledge of the range of human behaviors and what we're capable of. It does not mean that we need to practice all those things. I couldn't be a hunter-gatherer if I wanted to because I didn't grow up in that environment. I'm not saying we need to be hunter-gatherers. I'm saying let's look at the way that some of these people groups around the world today and from the past behaved. And let's take ideas from it and let's have a better discussion about what might be practicable. I think that could be fruitful. It excites me. Excites me to think about what might be possible. Let's aim for the stars, and if we land on the moon, then that's great.
I used to say that all the time. And I think ultimately, too, we're trying to remove shame from the conversation. We're trying to make productive conversations where we're not just making ourselves and other people wrong, bad. Just you should be ashamed for even thinking these thoughts. And that to me is just so unproductive and silly. It's just like, look, have your views. The truth is, a lot of people have different preferences.
Yeah.
Some people, this conversation might be interesting for them, but deep down, they know that monogamy is the only thing that they actually want.
Mm-hmm.
Not because someone told them or there's some social pressure from religion. That's just genuinely what they want in their life, and that's what they prefer, and that's what they want to pursue. And that's, I don't hear you criticizing that.
No.
What I hear you saying is not everyone is like that, and we need some narratives to create space for them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And I think another thing that I would say too is one way that we have made space for non-monogamy, even within a so-called ostensibly monogamous context, is we allow for divorce and remarriage, or we allow for relationships to end and move on. And I have had to check myself because I have been judgmental towards, and I think it's a lot of because of the experiences I had coming from a broken home, but I've been judgmental of people who have had a relationship end, a marriage end. But then I realized that's not, I'm stopping myself from saying that was a failed marriage. No, it was a relationship that had ups and downs, good times and bad, and it came to an end.
It ended, yeah.
And
that's the
many
story
things come to
yeah.
an end in our lives, and that doesn't make them failed. But you move on to an opportunity because we grow as people. We change, they change, our goals change.
Or one person changes and the other doesn't. And the relationship changes because of that. Yeah.
It's good that we have that. We didn't used to have that opportunity in certain cultures to do, and it's not available today in certain cultures. And so that's wonderful. And I wouldn't judge people for that. I would want the same kind of grace for that myself. That doesn't mean failure. We got to stop. I think people should stop saying a failed marriage or see divorced people as bad second-class people.
Yeah.
I've seen, and I'll get personal here, I've seen the way, particularly religiously fundamentalist people, the way they've treated my mother who's been divorced, the way they treat her for actually having the courage to do what she thought was the right thing. Then think of her as a bad person, as a sinful person, because she decided to end a relationship that wasn't serving her anymore and she wasn't happy in. Yeah. And so that has affected me, and that continues to guide me.
Yeah, and I'll wrap things up, and I hope you don't mind me calling this out a bit, but you've used the word broken twice for your family. And I would say, it wasn't broken. It was a difficult challenge that circumstances brought upon you. Like my children have parents that are divorced, and they don't have a broken home. Part of that, I've worked very, very hard, and along with my ex-wife, we've worked very, very hard to mitigate some of the changes that they've gone through, and that it's not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong, that these things are actually a lot more normal than you think. And nowadays, all the kids are talking about their parents getting divorced. So their kid, they don't see themselves as like ostracized, but it is a difficult challenge. Just like if the family stayed intact and you moved a bunch, that's a difficult transition.
That's right. Yeah.
When we add to that words like broken or because it's not the ideal is when the shame creeps in. I would just say there's no reason to feel ashamed. But you were likely had to experience a lot of it due to other people's insistence on the ideal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Boom. Dramatic pause.
Yeah. That's good. It's a good word. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Amen. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. Maintaining monogamy or practicing promiscuity. Definitely a lead balloon conversation. Would love to hear some feedback from you guys. Do you want to make a call out on how people can give us some feedback?
Yeah, so we are available at leadballoonspod.com. We also have a YouTube channel called Lead Balloons Podcast. Lead Balloons Podcast.
We have an email, right?
Yes. The email is leadballoonspodcast@gmail.com. Our podcast is available on Podbean as well as Spotify, and we should hopefully, fingers crossed, soon be available on Apple Podcasts. And if you go to our website, that's kind of a good hub because we have episodes, our most recent episodes, available there. And we also have, Joel and I are each blogging. His is Medicinal Masculinity, and mine is Only Imagine. And we have weekly blogs that are being posted there. And you can just learn more about us as well and interact with us there.
Yeah. Come check us out. Peace, you all.